Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, April 22nd, 2024, and today we're going to be talking about the state of North Carolina and the 2024 presidential and gubernatorial election that will likely be the main focus for both Democrats and Republicans this coming November in this exceptionally competitive battleground state. Now, North Carolina is a state that Democrats have long been fighting for since they won it in the 2008 presidential election. In the last presidential race, Donald Trump defeated Joe Biden by a margin of 1.3% across the state. But other than that, North Carolina had relatively been ultimately competitive. When you take a look at where it was even in the 2022 midterm elections, in the Senate race here, the Republican Party did not actually win this state by an exceptionally large amount. Ted Budd won by 3.2% despite the polls estimating that he would win in this state by anywhere from 6 to 7 to 8 points. Fundamentally, North Carolina was a close and competitive state, and it showed that Democrats in some reality would be able to win this battleground state. In the 2008 presidential, as I mentioned, this was the last time the Democrats won in North Carolina, but the interesting circumstances surrounding this upcoming race seem to suggest that North Carolina could once again become a state the Democrats end up winning on the presidential level. Although President Biden is not performing at max capacity when it comes down to general election data, you don't really see him leading Donald Trump poll after poll the way he did in 2020 or arguably Hillary Clinton did back in 2016. You're seeing more of an American public that is more pro-Trump than they had been in years past. But that isn't to say that there isn't an avenue here for Joe Biden. Right now, North Carolina has seen a whole new onslaught of new ads and field offices and investments from the National Democratic Party. And a lot of that has to do with an estimation that the North Carolina governor's race could be the opening required for a Democratic victory in this battleground state. Now, to give you a bit more context, the state of North Carolina actually has a Democratic governor that was first elected in 2016 on the same ballot that Hillary Clinton had lost the state to Donald Trump. But then in 2020, Roy Cooper, the incumbent Democratic governor here, won re-election by 4.5%. Now, this margin of victory was pretty large. Dan Forest was the incumbent lieutenant governor at the time, and Dan Forest really didn't have too many scandals. He was associated largely with the former administration, Governor Pat McCrory, and just generally speaking had less of, name recognition, had less notable accomplishments, and was just largely seen as somebody who was put on the back burner by the mainstream GOP. And so voters didn't exactly, obviously, positively respond to that. We saw that Dan Forest ended up with roughly 47% of the vote, which was actually a lot better than what the polls had suggested. But a large reason why he was losing the polls was because voters didn't really know who he was in the first place. It wasn't necessarily that he was someone who significantly outperformed expectations or had come into this with, as the underdog status. He very much was and remained to be the underdog, but that wasn't some type of, reason for that he was this amazing candidate who was able to outperform the polls. He just was a Republican on the ballot and voters voted the way that they did. But Roy Cooper's margin of victory here of 4.5% against a candidate who was significantly less problematic than the current nominee for governor on the Republican side really calls into question. Do Democrats just have the upper hand in the governor's race that doesn't necessarily translate to the general election, or even some down-ballot races like the ones we see here in the U.S. Senate race, where Thom Tillis, the incumbent senator at the time, was able to defeat Cal Cunningham, who arguably was a scandal-prone Democrat here, won re-election by roughly 2 percentage points across the state. I think North Carolina, at the baseline, is not a state that leans Democrat really in any race. I think Democrats have gotten lucky in the governor's race by running strong candidates. Roy Cooper, who had largely been perceived as a very strong challenger in 2016 and then incumbent governor at the time in 2020. I mean, we really have seen Democrats just do very well in terms of who they are nominating for these upcoming races. And when it comes down to this upcoming presidential race, and of course the gubernatorial race, Democrats have Joe Biden, again, the incumbent president, but they have the attorney general, Josh Stein, who won re-election back in 2020 by arguably a very close race. You can see here that he won in his statewide race by a margin of 0.2%. So he doesn't come in as this exceptionally strong electoral juggernaut, but he does come in as someone who was able to win in a statewide position in a way, in a race where arguably the Republican candidate here should have won. That is really what we know about this state, that North Carolina and almost every other race, including Mark Robinson, who actually is now running for governor as a Republican here. Mark Robinson received 52% of the vote. Josh Stein, the incumbent attorney general, elected in 2016, won re-election. And so now he's up again in 2024. But now Josh Stein leads the governor's race. He's the Democrat, and he widens his advantage over Mark Robinson. And so you might be wondering, why exactly does that matter? Why does this give the opportunity for Joe Biden, an opportunity for victory, at least, in this battleground state? And it all has to do with the Republican side. Mark Robinson is the incumbent lieutenant governor, but largely did not get that much media recognition even when he was running for lieutenant governor back in 2020. It typically is not a race that voters care about to the same extent that they care about the governor's race or the national race or the Senate race, whatever it might be. The lieutenant governor's race is often put on the back burner in a way that even the governor's race is not, or even the attorney general's race is simply not. And so Mark Robinson, despite having a lot of these scandals first pop up back in 2020, more recently we've seen them become a very, very mainstream part of this election and a very big reason as to why he's losing across the state. Just taking a look at Mark Robinson's Wikipedia page, you can start to see exactly why he isn't perceived as the strongest Republican nominee. Again, with a state that has a history of electing Democrats to the governorship, it doesn't really come at a good point where you have, under your political views and remarks section, anti-Semitic remarks, Holocaust denial, anti-gay and transphobic comments, and other controversial remarks. Quite frankly, Mark Robinson is one of the most scandal-plagued Republicans that the GOP could have nominated for the governorship in North Carolina. This is a race that was absolutely winnable against an incumbent who had maybe won his attorney general's race by 0.2%, but really didn't come into this with that strong of an electoral presence, certainly not in the way that Governor Roy Cooper did. But he might get it. Because Mark Robinson has all of these scandals here, we are already starting to see the direct impact of that. When you take a look at the Robinson versus Stein matchup on the North Carolina governor's side, Josh Stein leads by 3 points, and in the most recent poll from Quinnipiac University, the only poll, besides the one I'm about to show you, the only poll done across the entire month of April shows Josh Stein up by 8 points. When you take a look at the most recent poll, the one that we're talking about here, this one actually coming from Meredith College, I believe, they release a result here that shows that Josh Stein has a 9-point advantage over Mark Robinson. A 9-point advantage, 45 to 36. Now, this poll actually was done months ago, and the lead here for Josh Stein went from a 4-point lead, now a 9-point lead, where Josh Stein leads amongst women, amongst men, and amongst every single age group. And the reason for that is because a lot of the comments that he has been making and comments that he recently has made have started to become more popularized and brandished across the state. For instance, a new video leaked where it showed Mark Robinson, and Democrats certainly were sitting on this piece of opposition research, and it leaked the day after he won the GOP nomination. It showed that Mark Robinson said that he wishes that the American public could go back to a time in which women could not vote. It showed that Mark Robinson did not believe in a women's right to vote, in the 19th Amendment. What we found here was that Mark Robinson had made comments like these and many others that Democrats are now capitalizing on now that he is the Republican nominee. Because while they tried to use it back in 2020, and that is certainly the case, you can see that some of these things actually became popularized when he ran for lieutenant governor. It didn't land because this race, quite frankly, did not matter. But now it does. And voters are paying attention. And Democrats desperately wanted him to be the Republican nominee for governor. Why do you think they sat on all this information until after he won the primary? It was a very, very intricately planned out, way of releasing all this opposition research, dumping it on the GOP so they don't have an immediate response. They don't have a way to try to turn this around. And I want you to think just for a moment, on the side of a political analyst lens, what else do they have? Because if they were able to release something as jarring as this the day after he won the primary, what are they sitting on for the October surprise? Because given a lot of what we know about him, that before the funding has started to pour in heavily, even more on the Democratic side, before the ads have started to become reeling in and in and in, a lot of these things were brought up in 2020, brought up again in 2024. But a lot of the things that we're starting to see too, things like this, are released by Democratic operatives, are released by people in the media as well. And I can't help but thinking, there is going to be something that drops in October. Something that will completely slam dunk this campaign for Josh Stein. And it would help the Democratic Party up across the ballot, including President Biden, who right now on average, Josh Stein leads by 3, where President Biden loses by 4. But what we saw in 2020 on the presidential level is that while Joe Biden did make improvements across the state, he was likely carried to those improvements based on Roy Cooper's performance. A 4.5% victory by a Democrat across the state absolutely could carry you to a closer victory chance in the general election, even at the top of the ticket. Because what we know is that voters rarely vote against any of the parties that they're voting for on their ballot. If they're voting for a Republican for one thing, 90% of the times they're voting for a Republican on everything else. And the same thing for Democrats. The governor's race obviously was different. North Carolina doesn't lean blue. This isn't some type of Trump overperformance in a blue state. This is a red state. But when the numbers start to get better for somebody like Josh Stein, as a poll here might suggest that shows Josh Stein with a 9-point advantage, take a look at the lead that Joe Biden has over Joe Biden. Donald Trump leads 41-39 over Joe Biden. An advantage here. This three-way race that they're deciding with RFK Jr., Trump only leads by 2. Why does that matter? Well, the last time they did a poll here, Donald Trump led by more. And I can't help but think, when Donald Trump led by a larger amount in the last the last iteration of this poll, and then all of a sudden Josh Stein makes a 5-point leap across the state. What does that mean? I think there's a connection here. In January in this poll, Trump led by 5 points. I don't think they have it here on the RCP average, but we can find that back in January, Trump had a 5-point advantage. Now it's 2. The governor's race back in January, Josh Stein was up by 4. Now it's 9. And so the swing there, a 3-point swing on the presidential, with a 5-point swing on the governor's race, shows that Josh Stein, in a way, is carrying over voters to Joe Biden. And while there may be a case to be made that Joe Biden has made improvements, the overall average in North Carolina has not seen that consistent of an improvement, but has seen improvement since then. But you know who has also seen improvement? Josh Stein. When these polls were initially fielded, and people didn't know Josh Stein the way they knew Mark Robinson, but arguably, both of them had relatively low name ID. They were at 41 and 42%, but Mark Robinson was still taking out the advantage. Most recently, though, Josh Stein has been popularized. He's been a well-known name across the state and is building up voters. Mostly voters on the, swingable side who are simply against Mark Robinson. And it also doesn't help, too, that North Carolina doesn't just have Mark Robinson as the only more, extreme candidate that's running across this state. You're also seeing that just simply in North Carolina, when it comes down to the election in this state, let's see if we can find it here. I want to show you the state superintendent race because it's interesting and it matters. The state superintendent race, I don't know if they have a Wikipedia page for it, but I'm going to tell you this. Research it. Look into the Republican nominee for governor, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about extremism in North Carolina. When I talk about someone who is unelectable beyond degree. You have a Republican nominee for state superintendent who called on the public execution of former Democratic presidents and the incumbent Democratic president. You have a nominee on the governor's side, on the state superintendent side, who have leaned into conspiracy theory after conspiracy theory. Mark Robinson himself, who has been completely condemned by Jewish leaders across the country and across the state for anti-Semitic remarks. You see him making comments about wanting to go back to a time in which women did not have the right to vote. A lot of these things that we are seeing on the side of the Republicans in North Carolina is simply not an effective strategy, obviously. Not an effective strategy to win the election. And so why does this matter for the presidential? Well, it does make all the difference. When you look at a state like Pennsylvania, and I know you might be wondering, why am I bringing you into this state, a state that, has nothing to do with North Carolina? Well, Pennsylvania is a unique case study because in this state, there is supposedly a competitive Senate race, but one that Democrats are demolishing their Republican opponents here. You see Dave McCormick, the Republican nominee for Senate. You have Bob Casey Jr., who's running as the incumbent Democrat. He's been here for decades, right? Or his family's been here for decades. He's been here for quite a while. He's running for re-election. He leads Dave McCormick by a very large amount, 8, 9, 10 points in the polls. Joe Biden does better. When you see improvements for him, you see improvements for Biden. When Casey goes up, so does Biden. And when Casey's lead is larger, so is Biden's. And I think it's very interesting. It's not to say that none of this is on Biden making improvements in this state. He's been visiting it a lot. He's been investing a lot into the state. Absolutely. But I do think there is a point where we can say those further down the ballot sometimes can carry Joe Biden across the finish line. We've seen it happen before on a presidential level. We've seen it happen, and we will see it happen again. It will happen in November. The question is for which side? I really don't know, but I think right now we are seeing a direct impact of some of these more down ballot races. Opportunities like the Pennsylvania Senate race and the North Carolina governor race that present these opportunities for the Biden victory in these states, where North Carolina reasonably could go blue because of a large enough advantage that Democrats have built up in the governor's race. And so it'll be very interesting to see Because the more Democratic voters that they turn out simply to vote for Josh Stein because Mark Robinson they paint as an extremist, as someone who is not fit to be governor, the more and more that voters get out there and vote for any Democrat, including Josh Stein, on that alone, their likelihood of voting for Joe Biden increases, and of course, their likelihood of voting at all increases tremendously altogether. And so it'll be very interesting to see the direct impact of the Mark Robinson and Josh Stein campaign and the governor's race that will be all-consuming in North Carolina on top of the presidential, because I do think there is going to be an impact. In the same way we've been seeing it in Pennsylvania, I think we will see it in North Carolina, and only time will tell if it's enough to bring Biden over the finish line this coming November. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.